So very much welcome to this seminar on women's power to prevent conflict and promote democracy. My name is Helena Bjuremalm. I'm the deputy head of the Division for Democracy and Human Rights at Sida, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. I used to be on the board of FUF, the Association for the... no, I lost it. You have it in English somewhere? Well, anyway, FUF, Föreningen för utvecklingsfrågor, the Association of Development Issues. Swedish Development Forum, thank you very much. Sorry for that faulty introduction. I have the privilege of introducing to you Anne Atambo, who is the president of the Kenyan section of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, abbreviated WILP. So if I say WILP, it's not that I have a problem, I just pronounce the acronym, WILP. Unfortunately, Joy Onyes, who's the international president of the organization, had a visa problem, so she won't be able to join us. But Anne is here. What we will do is I will ask a couple of questions to begin with for maximum half an hour. I'm not going to ask questions for half an hour. I'm going to invite Anne to respond to some brief questions. And then the floor is the audience's. So we very much like to welcome questions. And we'll run this event for up to about an hour. So we should be finished by 7 p.m.-ish. So I'm going to sit down and ask. And the first question, what is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom?
So thank you so much for having us here. My name is Anne Atambo, and I represent the Kenyan section of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, abbreviated as WILF, and I think in Swedish is IKFF. Yeah. So, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is an international non-governmental organization, and it's essentially a women's peace movement. And it started the Kenyan section quite recently in 2015, and up until to date, there's even more new sections coming up across African countries. And essentially, we work towards women's rights, peace and security, and just because of how diverse the context is in Africa and Kenya, the implementation ways of how we try to address the women's rights is a bit diverse, but the ends essentially is just to secure women's rights. That would be the main goal of WILF sections, and in Kenya as well, we try to speak to the root causes of what it means to be a woman in Kenya and what it is we can contribute to ensure that at the end of the day, women's rights are heard and addressed, regardless of whichever background you're from.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that introduction. I'm going to put you on the spot a bit and ask you, in one word, what is peace?
Safety.
Okay.
That would be the first word that comes to my mind. Safety.
Very good. Yeah. I'm going to continue putting you on the spot. What is freedom in one word?
Security.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the last putting you on the spot question. What is democracy in one word? I'm going to be nicer later on.
Okay, it seems like today's one word day. I think democracy, from my perspective, would be speech. Having the opportunity to just air your voice, be heard, and talk about the things that are extremely meaningful to you. And I think, in a sense, speech is one of those things that are not necessarily, we don't have direct democracy in Kenya, and if we do, it usually happens in a span of, 10 years, where we have a direct referendum. And so speech is one of those things that we try and find ways to get the voices from the masses to be heard. Yeah, so that would be democracy for us.
So you might sort of rephrase your vision of WILP with the three S words: safety, security, speech.
Yeah.
If you ever need to explain what you do in 3 words, you have those.
Yeah, we do essentially, because safety, we pick the word security, because it's quite relative, and again, just with how diverse the Kenyan ecosystem is, you find that people in the rural areas, what security means to them is just food on your plate. But then again, it could be in the urban context, it would be the freedom to be able to just pick wherever you want to walk and not have anyone harass you. And so essentially, at the end of the day, WILF Kenya tries to speak to the 3 S's, as you've put it. Yeah.
Thank you. Speaking about your organization, it started quite recently. Could you tell us a little bit about how the journey of WILF Kenya started?
WILF Kenya started in 2015. I mean, it's quite recent considering the history of WILF International spans 100 years. It took a while for the WILF section to start off, but essentially it entailed a lot of communication with WILF International and trying to find opportunities for people to contribute to the peace conversations and engagements that are happening in Kenya. I think peace building started to come quite to the fore because in 2007, that was the first time we had a very large conflict situation in the country, and it resulted from the conflict around the announcement of presidential results from the election that we had at that time. It spanned from 2007 December till 2008, and it was quite a difficult period. And again, if you look coming through the next few years that we've had, Kenya has a lot of conflict based on just how we are positioned in East Africa. We have, there's cases of violent extremism coming up because of just how close we are to Somalia. And so it's really important that WILF sections are able to speak to emerging topics like this. So we had conflict that is quite diverse. We have the ones that are cyclical during electoral periods. Again, we have emerging conflicts from violent extremism. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Speaking about the growth of the WILF section in Kenya, as far as I understand, just a couple of years ago, there were only 4 sections in Africa, and now there are there are around 18. What do you think accounts for that growth across the continent?
I think across the continent, because of just how connected the regions are, it's quite easy to be able to identify some of the challenges that run across the regions. And more often than not, we have election, violence-related crises happening. Again, just the way I've mentioned, the issue about violent extremism, so it spans between Somalia, Kenya, again, Boko Haram in West Africa, and also some of the challenges that we have in terms of resources and the accountability that we're able to have to our governments. And so because of just how there's a common stream of the challenges that we have, and I guess once you go to once you come into contact with organizations like WILF, and then you're able to see what it is they're doing in their countries, and then you're able to realize, okay, fine, we have this almost similar challenges in our countries, and this is a platform that can also be used to serve these needs, because it's working in Kenya, it's working in Uganda. Perhaps it's something that can also be replicated in my country to serve these specific needs that we have that seem to be quite similar. Yeah.
What do you see the future trajectory of WILF in Africa? Do you think it will continue to grow at this high speed rate, or will it more sort of consolidate around the existing sections?
I think, interestingly enough, I definitely think that it will continue growing. We've had, by the time WILF section was coming up, we had, I think we were the 8th section. And right now there's around 15 countries that are also trying to establish WILF sections in their country. Why I think it will continue growing is because there's this consensus that women's rights need to be spoken to. There's this sort of awareness. There has been a lot of engagements on women's rights. And so more people are being, I don't want to say brave, because brave is not the word. It's just being awoken to the fact that these are issues that are happening to me. I can speak to them, I can contribute, and there's some level of support that is also happening amongst the countries. So there's a lot of communications that happen. When it comes to issues around peace building and movements. There's a lot of the populations have really warmed up to the significance of having partnerships across the board, because then it's easier to learn from what another section is doing. You get that sort of support, which initially was not existing. And so there's also the fact that there's easy access to information and mentorship, which really helps to increase the confidence that the people have to be able to do similar things. Now, the good thing about WILF, and why I think it will keep growing, is that they have a general framework that they work towards. So in this period from 2018 to 2021, there's 4 main thematic areas that WILF sections across the world will be working on. And that is human rights. There's the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is on United Nations Resolution 1325. There's militarization. And then there's the question of the environment. And in as much as we have these 4 thematic areas, WILF section is, how WILF works is that you're given these topics, there's these resources that are available to you, but because in my country it might be a bit different how the political climate is, WILF allows you to work with your current situation. And so we might be talking about issues on environment, but how I employ it, how I have dialogues around it in my country might be different from how you might do it at yours. And so that's why I think more sections will be coming up, because across Africa especially, and also across the globe, because there's sort of support resource-wise and technically as well to enable you to speak to certain agenda in a manner that is effective in your country, and that makes it a bit more sustainable, and it gives the population the opportunity to claim these successes as their own. And so it doesn't feel imposed on, it's more participatory and inclusive. And I think that's one of the strengths that I would quickly pick up from organizations that work from an international perspective. Yeah.
You mentioned the political climate, and on a related note, as most of you I'm sure are aware, democratic space tends to be shrinking in most countries in the world, not only in Kenya and Nigeria. And that's something that, sadly speaking, seems to affect women activists more than men, as that civic space is sometimes the only space women have, because they might not have the space that they need in their families, in their workplace, at universities, etc. Is that something that you sense to WILF Kenya, that your space is shrinking, changing, and affecting the work you want to do?
Yeah, I think I would mention the fact that indeed...
Or in the region, if you prefer that.
Yeah, in the region, you know, there's a lot of... Again, the political goodwill tends to change, and that also affects what you would have thought would be the best system in which your organization or your movement works. And despite the fact that it could be changing, there's also opportunities to find ways to counter it. And so there's been lots of ideas about how to engage the public and how such organizations that speak to human rights or work on women's issues try to find alternative ways and alternative messaging to endear to the public, and also not to really ruffle the political feathers that are there, because you still need that political goodwill to enable your organization to exist as a platform for effecting change. So it could be subtle, it could be in subtle forms, it could also be online, and we've had many cases where people just find interesting ways to sneak in the issue of human rights. And because in Africa there's a lot of issues on economic development, so you'd find most people try to find ways of enhancing that component of economic growth, and then also saying, yes, we'll give you this training on how to make better financial decisions, or how to get food for your family, but then again we can also talk about, you know, your rights, your human rights, and so people find intriguing ways to really have this meaningful conversations happening. Yeah.
So it sounds like you find like really good tactics to change that space in your to your advantage.
Yes,
in a way.
you have to, and it has to be really participatory so that it doesn't feel too imposed, and you kind of disconnect yourself from the public, and so people have to really find alternative ways to engage and have that dialogue. Yeah.
Does it happen that the government still calls civil society evil society, like it used to do previously?
In Kenya, it really depends, because it depends on just what kind of method that you use. We have the ones that are extremely, radical, you know, they would say things as they are, name names, not afraid to ruffle feathers, and obviously that puts you on the spot. Again, it also depends on the machinery and the engine that runs that organization. Are they willing to be put on the spot? Are they willing to release all the extremely controversial documents that they know the government does not want to speak to? Again, it also depends on just how willing someone is to risk their lives, their families, and the organizations and partners that they work with in order to have certain conversations happening. I think the one person that I know is not really scared to it, he got deported from Kenya. And so, again, like I said, it just depends on how willing you are to risk everything. Yeah.
Right. On a related note, maybe more like, say, from a partner, relatives, or community perspective, in a lot of communities, women aren't expected to raise their voices or, you know, be empowered. So there might be a stigma around like speaking up in public and, you know, presenting your views and standing up for your rights. Is that something you've experienced like, in your section or like in your contacts with other sections in Africa?
I think it would be interesting to note Kenya as a country has not really had grave civic challenges in terms of conflicts that spans years continuously. Ours is quite cyclical, and we kind of have seen the trend over the past few years, and it happens especially towards election period, where you find our politics is very ethnic based, and that really started off from the moment we got our independence. And so how colonization worked, British rule, it was divide and rule. And so once the settlers left, it was, so this community, you give me one leader, and this community, you give me one leader. And that is what has been ingrained in how our politics works to date. And so you find that it's quite hard to be able to say, okay, fine, this is how the politics has been working, but this is where it needs to be. And that's where we find the conflicts. We have specific points where we just know conflict might arise, and this is how you need to start mitigating it. Yeah.
Speaking about mitigation of conflicts, if somebody would sort of stop you in the street and ask you, why is it important to include women in the prevention of conflict, in the mitigation of conflict, in management of conflict, and the promotion of democracy?
In 2007, when we had our conflict, the largest one that we ever had, I think they even termed it, you know, Kenya is burning, because it was extremely, graphic and really bad. And so there were reports that around 3,000 girls were raped. And at that point in time, rape is what emerged as a tool in that time of war. I think, again, going to your previous question, before people never used to think of peace as one of the topics that one would engage in, because we were quite a peaceful country. And then after that conflict, people started understanding the significance of having peace and peace building as one of the topics that people really need to focus on. And then there was an element of now more women realizing that we actually need to organize and come together, because during times of war, rape is being used against us. And it has been a challenge that so many people are trying to address over the period of time. And WILF is really important because some of the opportunities that exist within WILF, for example, in Nigeria, they have been organizing the Women's Situation Room, which essentially speaks to during election periods, they station women across the country, and they give a free direct toll line to call in and give the account of what is happening during that period. And why we see that works there, it's also something that can be replicated across other African countries. And so it seems like a very great opportunity to be able to find mechanisms for preventing conflict. And that's one of the ways that people can use to mitigate conflict. Yeah,
by sharing information.
Yeah.
I'm going to conclude with two more specific questions about your work in Kenya. I know that there are two projects that you're very much engaged with. One is called the Mama Boma Project, and the other one is called the Kenyan Women's Voices Podcast. They both sound very interesting. Could you share this? What are they about?
So the Mama Boma Project, Mama means mother and Boma means a community. And so we came up with the Mama Boma Project because we realized that we need to have more women engaged together, having discourse and finding ways that work for them in order to create some sort of meaningful livelihood, resilience in the communities that they have. And so how Mama Boma works is that it's a group of women that come together, and we teach them on civic education and give them skills on financial literacy. And based on that, they're able to really say that this is what we need to get us to the next level. And so we have we use that opportunity again to bring in the element of civic education, topics on peace and security as pertains women, and we've had very interesting outcomes from it because it spans different challenges that they have. So we had one organization that housed children it was a children's home, and so essentially what they did is stemming from the activities that we had with them, they now started making bags to sell in order to maintain the running activities at the home that they have to take care of the children. And then they would have training sessions to equip them on how to make better financial decisions, how to have a better understanding of their rights. And in one session that we had with them, with their children, we were talking about the understanding of human rights, because we really find it important that they're able to have a better understanding of what the law has provided for them. And we asked them if they thought that human rights, children's rights are universal. And the interesting answer is that they said they're not universal.
Really?
Yeah, and so it just goes to show that there's a need to have more of these educative sessions with them, and to find what it is that brings them together, and then put in the elements of civic education, and that is the one on Mama Boma. And the Kenya Women's Voices podcast is a podcast that we have, and we think of it as a tool for telling the stories of what it means to be a Kenyan woman today, and what are the challenges that we have, but more importantly, where is it that we intend to be, or where we think that we need to go. And so in Africa, it's quite devoid of the rich oral history. There hasn't been ways to really capture the stories that have been happening over the period of years, and we think that Mama Boma, the Kenya Women's Voices podcast, is a great platform to really harness those stories, but also we see it as an opportunity to let people know about what it is that they need to know. And why I say basically just let people know what it is they need to know, we had an interesting question on the root causes of conflict, and we were looking at the provision on sexual and gender-based violence. And we realized that people are not even aware of what they need to do once they have been violated. So a question as rape, we realized that people don't necessarily know what the law requires of them to be able to have some sort of justice for the misfortune that has happened to them. And we uncovered that sometimes when they go and ask for the form that they need to fill out at the police station, sometimes they're asked to pay for it. And because of just how much they're not in touch with or how much they're not aware of what they need to know in terms of the legal provisions, then sometimes they have to pay for it. And what happens when you don't have the money to pay for it? And so we see the Kenya Women's Voices podcast as a really great platform to really share out the information that makes them active members of society, and also to exercise the law to bring justice for them.
Do you have any sort of statistics about like your audience, like how many people listen, or do they listen like from across the country, or is it more like particular communities that would tune into the podcast?
Because the podcast obviously is really is a digital platform. Most of the people that listen to our podcast are between the ages of 25 to 35, and because that really cuts off a huge population from interacting with the podcast, we usually play snippets of it every time we go to the community, because that also helps them to have an excerpt into what it is other people are discussing on that platform as well. So it's really been interesting, and it also helps us to uncover some of the ill practices that happen, and people might not necessarily be open to discussing them in a really public platform. And an interesting one that we found was that in some communities, people think that if your significant other doesn't beat you up, then they don't love you. And it's those really interesting, almost hidden cultural elements that we're able to share on that platform, because they don't have to come and say, this is my name and this is what happens to me. But through the podcast, then we're able to get an insight into what really happens, and we're able to offer solutions and advice to some of the things that happen culturally as well.
Thank you very much for sharing these very rich insights. I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments. Do we need a microphone for the questions? There is a microphone. So if you could please just say your name and your question, and then maybe we'll take like around 2-3 questions, and invite Anne to answer those, and then we'll take another few rounds. So who's going to be the brave first person?
I can start with one.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So my name is Karin. I'm from the Swedish section of WILF, IKFF. And I've already had the privilege to spend 2 days with Anne. And as I think you've noticed, one of the things that really impressed me with the work that you do is how you, in very creative ways, like create your own democratic space. So my question to you is if you would like to describe these 2 applications that you've come up with to work with voluntarism and security.
As you had asked about the perception that people have to feminism and peace building, because of the challenges that we've been having, people have been a bit more sensitized to the needs of having such engagements on peace building. And what we realize is that, obviously some people have this negative attitude when you say, I'm a feminist, or you subscribe to some feminist ideologies. And so because we try to make it quite open and inclusive, and try to make it in a way that we need you to be part of us. Just because we take a feminist approach to peace building doesn't mean that if you're a man or if you're not female, then we do not necessarily have anything to do with you. And so that's why we decided to come up with 2 applications. And the motivation for the first one is essentially the one on youth and development, is because we have a crisis on youth unemployment in the country. And the funny thing is that 70% of the population is made up of young people, but there are not enough jobs. And since there are not enough jobs, it makes them more vulnerable to things that could lead them to, you know, and you know what they say about an idle mind? Yeah, they say, it's a proverb, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. And so we're trying to find ways of engaging young people. Why we want to do that is because in the conflicts that we have, we find that people that have access to means look for young people to further their agenda. So it could be during the conflicts, say ethnic conflicts or whatever. We find people that have means probably purchase guns, give it to the young people, and ask them to go to that community. Because, as I mentioned, politics and crisis in Africa, in Kenya specifically, is very ethnic based. And so we came up with an application that is trying to connect young people to volunteering opportunities, because every time we have an event or an organization, they say, oh my gosh, how can I be a part of it? Because people are really eager to find ways of contributing to the development of, I would like to say everybody wants to have some sense of self-actualization. And because the opportunities are not enough, it could be just as simple as, can I come and just, you know, usher people in? Because it gives them a sense of contribution to something meaningful. And so we call the app Sauti. Sauti means voice. And through the app, we give young people opportunities to volunteer. So for example, if my organization has an event like today, I say I need volunteers to come, and they're able to pick the ones that they want. But for us, because we're trying to also enhance the capacity of young people, what you, as an organization, you give back to them is you have to give them professional feedback, because we're trying to improve who they are, how they can also grow into what they need to become. And so that's the one that we want to do on youth and professional development through volunteerism. And so if an organization wants to give them more, like maybe some sort of packs, that's upon them. But the main thing that they're supposed to give is professional feedback on what they can do to improve themselves, what they can do to become better. And another thing from the application, again, as I said, we're always trying to find the smallest of ways to enhance women, peace and security. And so from a very biased perspective, we want everybody to also, if you're a volunteer and you participated, or you're an organizer that had volunteers, you're supposed to give us feedback on how safe that place felt. Why we want to do that is because women talk about, oh my gosh, it's not safe, because sometimes there's that element of insecurity. But then if I ask you, what does it mean it's not safe? Because my mom always tells me, don't go, it's not safe. But then I'm asking her, but mom, what do you mean it's not safe? And so we're trying to find ways of being able to quantify, because that data is also very important. We want to be able to understand what it means for you. You're saying it's not safe, but what about it did not feel safe? So we're also looking at it as a way of getting that sort of data on safe spaces, because then it would be able to help to improve legislation and policy on making safe public spaces from a gendered perspective. And so that's the one way that we're trying to use that app. And the second app that we want to do is on food and the environment. So there's a question of food safety in Africa. There's especially in Kenya. We have aflatoxin in our food. So aflatoxin really is in the maize dairy value chain. And we were doing a project to try and understand ways of combating aflatoxin in our food. So how it happens is that cows eat affected maize, and we drink the milk from the cows, and we eat the milk. We eat the cow, beef and whatnot. But then it still gets to us. So the thing about this is that in most of the agricultural communities, most of them grow food from a subsistence perspective, because land is not too easily accessible, and so they grow food in small farms. And so maybe when they grow the maize, they realize this maize is affected with aflatoxin, and then they say something like, I cannot eat it, but my cow can eat it. But then when the cow eats the affected maize, it still gets into the cow, and it still gets to the human somehow. And I think aflatoxin level in Europe is 0.4 parts per trillion, but because of the food insecurity and safety issues we have in Kenya, it's like the government allows to up to 40%. That's yeah, so it's way more. And what that means is that when children eat affected maize or milk, it causes stunted growth, and in adults it causes liver issues. And so through that app, we want to be able to make farmers aware of better ways to dry their food, because we realize that if they don't dry it well, then the maize gets affected. And also we want to be able to show them better ways of taking care of the animals, and also better ways of using farm produce. That's one component of it. The second component is obviously the climate change issue. Before, farmers could be able to tell, you know, the weather patterns, and this is what could happen. But because of the climate change, it's not easy anymore. And so with the app, we hope to be able to tell them, okay, the rain's expected to come this period, and so you can plant your seeds and whatever. And then the last bit is, through the app, we want to be able to have people request us to go and plant trees in whichever public spaces that they have, because Kenya is continually becoming arid and semi-arid. And so to counter that, we're hoping to use the application for that purpose.
So you have a lot of things on your plate that are all very interesting. Do you have, well, now you woke up, good. We have a question just to your right.
Hi, my name is Louise Ricknert, and I'm a board member of the Swedish section of WILP. And I'm so happy to be here today and, you know, listen to all the inspirational, how you work to reach youth and through volunteering and apps. And I think it's really, really inspiring, because these are questions that we are also working with, and challenges that we stand before. So I think you know, it's really wonderful getting to hear how you work in Kenya and with these challenges. And my question is, I guess it's also connected to the youth, the subject of youth, and also in Sweden we're working with environmentalism and the question of militarism, how you can sort of connect these two subjects with, of course, peace and security. So my question for you concerns how you see that subject, and how you view the challenge that we have in organizing across generations and across nations, because as we so often talk about, the climate change is a global problem, and so we have to work globally. And of course, I'm familiar with how we in the organization work with, you know, across the sister sections. But what's your view on that, and how do you, what are your ideas about maybe how we could improve it and work with the subject of climate change and sustainability across the generations and countries? Thank you very much.
That's quite a mouthful. Yes. Would love to hear your response. And then I know there was a question in the back, but I'll invite Anne to two questions in the back. Excellent. Yeah. So after your response, I'll invite you to.
I think one of the important things to mention is that obviously there's this question around, if you're older, you have more experience. And I think there tends to be some sort of stigma associated with either being old in a movement or too young, either you're naive or you're too old, you don't get this. But I think one of the important things, as you mentioned, is trying to create a platform where there seems to be some sort of, not too forced, but an easy environment to have some sort of dialogue. One of the ways that we also use is we have a policy hackathon. So recently we had a policy hackathon trying to talk about fully autonomous weapons. And what we do is that we invite everybody. It doesn't matter if you know too much or if you know too little. Again, as I mentioned, we are really trying to find ways of having dialogue and having the citizens contribute to democracy and policy making. And so we have a room and we have everyone. It doesn't matter if you know too much or if you know too little. And what we do, we have a brief introduction of what the topic is, and then we have different groups sit in small sections and just talk. And then at the end of, we make sure at least we have an expert and also someone that has a very lay understanding. And it can also be a child, because for us the most important thing is to be able to understand this is what people have an understanding of, this is where they are, and this is where they could be, and this is what the law can provide for them. And so I think, just having said that, is that creating platforms where people can feel free to talk, free from stigma. And I think one of the most important things is that we always say that, you know, like, even in as much as you don't know too much, by you expressing and saying that, even in those small groups, we always encourage people to talk, and we say anything goes, because it takes out the element of failure. I think as a society we're very averse, you know, from not knowing or not being able to do. And what we usually find interesting in creating those environment and that ambience where there's open dialogue is that the people that know are willing to share, and that creates an environment where there's some sort of connection and engagements and relationships that happen. And so when it comes to engaging young people, I think for us in our section it's a bit easier, because like I said, everybody is really trying to find ways to contribute to questions on democracy, human rights, and having that need to show that they're participating in making the environment or the community a better place. I was asking recently one of my colleagues in the Swedish section what young people think about traveling. I think that's also a nice way to enhance cooperation between sections, because you might find in some places the challenges that you might have here are not the same challenges that we might have there, but there's a way that they can connect. And so having young people travel to go to see different places, it enhances on their empathy. I think empathy is also really important to factor in, because it helps them to put themselves in somebody else's shoes, and because they might be coming from a different place, they bring different perspectives. And I think that sort of exposure is something that within sections and even within movements, it really helps a lot, and dialogue and understanding. But most importantly, giving room for failure, you know, like just saying, okay, fine, you came up with this, it doesn't work, it's fine. We just know that that's one way that doesn't work. Yeah, and I think that that room, especially just ensuring that there's some sort of dialogue and having a meeting point that contributes to an eventual goal is one way of trying to ensure that everyone's needs and expectations are met. Yeah.
Thanks. Very good answer to a very challenging question. There were two women at the far back with questions.
Thank you. My name is Helena. I'm from the Swedish International Center for Local Democracy. Thank you very much, Anne, for your presentation. It was quite interesting. You spoke about having to work in a space without ruffling the political feathers and the political leadership. And you briefly mentioned now the sort of need for policy change and youth engagement. And one of the areas that we work in our organization is the meaningful participation of youth in decision making. Our area of focus is the local level, which I suppose is also relevant for you. But my question is, what have you been able to do? Because you've done quite a lot in terms of citizen engagement from sort of like the front end, but have you been able to engage equally meaningfully with the political leadership in terms of influencing policy and changing attitudes from that end? That's my question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's an interesting
question. Mouthful.
That's an interesting question because, especially when you're starting out as a section, you need to be able to make sure that the work that you do is sustainable and that you're able to still let that platform that you're working for and with exist enough for further conversations to happen. Sadly, you need some sort of political goodwill. Sometimes you always find someone that is really interested to maybe create some space for you, and as you mentioned, it's really important to find someone in government or whichever platform it is to be able to, you know, help you get more connections. Why that is important is because at the end of the day, all this good work that you do, there's always someone that may be willing to listen and someone who is in government or whichever position out there at a, you know, high level, political level. And I think for us, we're really grateful because we have, we found a really interesting gentleman that works in government, and it's the Cabinet of Strategic Initiatives. And essentially what his role is to be able to identify emergent opportunities and link them to different government agencies in order to reap those benefits. And so in as much as some people are not really willing to ruffle all the political feathers, it's really still important to communicate the gains that you have. And why I still think it's really important to have those policy hackathons and just to make those documents is because at the point of lobbying, where you've collected all the information from the public, you know, as you said, civic engagement. When you're going to government, then you tell them, this is what the masses are saying, and you come with something empirical. And so it's still important to have all levels of that value chain really looked into and catered for, so that you just don't have civic engagement and then it ends up as a document that lies on the table. But then again, to still be able to identify continuously people in government or people that have access to the power structures that will be willing to lend an ear, because it just all starts with some sort of communication, and you have to think through the whole stretch. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you very much. There was a question.
Hi. She kind of asked one of my questions, but then my name is Nyamusi. I'm from the Afro-Swedish National Organization, and you mentioned that you have an audience of between the ages of 25 and 35, and I'm just wondering, because of due to the digital divide in Kenya, how do you navigate your audience? And within those conversations, are there also men in the room?
Yes. Interestingly enough, like I said, when we started, there's this whole thing around, especially from an African Kenyan perspective, if you say you're a feminist, it's like, man basher, but that's not essentially the case. And so we try and make our conversations to focus on gender equality and gender justice, because we understand that if you want to make room for women's rights to be heard, and most of the perpetrators are men, if you bash them, you kind of maybe close other doors where they could essentially listen to you. And so for our podcasts, we even have men come and talk about some of the work that they do. I think we had one on, in fact, we even have a partnership with a legal office that offers pro bono help for women who have experienced gender violence, and that organization is being led by a man. So yes, it's a feminist peace building movement, but we need the men as well, because when you want to have that sustainable mind shift happening around gender discourse, you need men in the room as well. And thank you for the two that are in the room as well.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. And I think we also, we had also mentioned that
the digital divide.
Yeah, we kind of take excerpts of the podcast and play it in open forums like this, so that there's some sort of continuity. It doesn't just live in the digital platforms only.
Maybe I'll add to that. Do you collaborate with community-based radio stations that have sort of like a rather short bandwidth, but they would reach out to communities?
Yes.
In the rural areas?
Yes, and that's one of the things that we really want to keep on increasing in terms of also that engagement. And in our next sessions, we want to have actual questions that come from the community. So we go to a community and ask them, this topic, what do you understand? What questions do you have? And then we want to ask them in the podcast. So there's also that element of engagement, both from a digital, live, like live feed if it was here, but then also trying to capture thoughts that might be not inside that room where the recording is happening.
Thank you. I'll do a final round of questions. There's one question from you, and is there like a final question from? No. Is it so you'll be the
Should I go without
final?
the microphone?
Yes, there's a microphone coming up to you.
Hi, my name is Hadi, and thank you for your presentation. I kind of have just, I guess, a comment and a question combined, which is that I think one of the biggest challenges with peace and security in Africa is that it has a cultural aspect to it, which is that women have a specific role that they're supposed to hold, right? So you're not supposed to get involved in certain things, leave that to the men. And I say Africa, although I like to speak country by country, but I'm just going to say Africa overall in general. And I think when I look at Liberia, for example, when Ellen Johnson became president, how she became so much more than just the president of Liberia, but it was like she became the president for Africa and for African women all over Africa. And I was a part of UN 1325 in Senegal, and she was always the role model amongst all the women in peace and security. But one of the other things they did was that there's always been this conversation about post-conflict countries between Anglophonian and Francophonian countries, and Anglophonian had for some reason done very well. We still haven't learned why in terms of post-conflict situations, but they've done very well. And I'm just wondering if you guys have captured lessons learned or ways of moving forward from these Anglophonian countries who've done well in terms of engaging women in peace and security, such as Liberia, because they do have a lot of women and a lot of females who are engaged in these activities. And I just wanted to know if you guys are drawing from that, and in retrospect, are you guys also sharing your lessons or the strategies that you are implementing with other countries as well?
I think I had mentioned about Women's Situation Room in Nigeria, and how the Women's Situation Room works, as you mentioned, in post-conflict communities. And we know that in most African countries, every time there's an general election happening, you need to be quite keen and on the ground and come up with crisis mitigation initiatives, because of just how elections tend to be hotspots for crisis to emerge. And the Women's Situation Room, interestingly, got its the whole concept around it from Sierra Leone, and so that's already something that we have reaped. We've reaped from the lessons that they've had, and we also want to implement them in other African countries. And also, because of WILF section, how it works, they usually have regional meetings. And so all these countries, Anglophone and Francophone, come together in a room like this, and there's a lot of discourse that happens. And we always share and learn from each other. And so I think, just to speak to what you've said, having that opportunity to get people that are actually working at the grassroots level to sit and talk eye to eye, open discussions, not using any sorts of inhibitions, to just talk about these are our challenges, this is how it worked for us, and this is what you can also do. And I think that's why WILF sections keep on growing in Africa, despite the fact that there's this element of shrinking space of what democracy is and how it is being implemented in Africa. And I think that's one of the ways that WILF is using. And that's why I also say that I think it will keep on growing. Yeah, because again, the question of having some sort of mentorship because even if you're a new emerging section, you see that this strategy worked in this Anglophone country or whatever, Francophone, but then it's also something that you can try and implement in your own country. And so I think for any international movement, it's really important to not just have the people that are at the high level, the ones that are at the grassroots, because they're the ones that still go back to these communities and get integrated. So yeah, that's what I would say.
That was a very good ending. We sort of ended where we started on the importance of safety, security, and speech. And maybe you could add another S, as in solidarity across sections.
Solidarity. Solidarity.
Yeah. So much, it seemed like you seem to have a very strong learning perspective in your organization, where you learn across sections, that sort of in solidarity with your sisters and brothers.
And brothers.
I'd like to thank Anna Tambo so much for sharing these insights. Personally, I find it very, very inspiring. I'm not going to speak for the audience, but you're still here after 1 hour, so I would assume that you also think it's very inspiring. And even though Joy couldn't join us, I think you did very well in sort of filling the shoes of a lot of people on the stage. So thank you so much, and thank you for joining. Thank you.